As we turn our gaze toward the story of Ruth, we first find ourselves immersed in a world defined by ancient alliances, economic hardship, and competing cultural loyalties. The scene opens in the period of the Judges, when Israel, though settled in the Promised Land, struggled with intermittent famine and wavering faithfulness. In this context, Bethlehem, Judah experienced a severe drought that emptied fields and threatened every family's survival. Naomi, her husband Elimelech, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, felt the pinch of scarcity so keenly that they made the difficult decision to leave their homeland and seek sustenance in the country of Moab. Ruth chapter 1 verse 1. Moab lay just east of the Dead Sea, a land both geographically close and ideologically distant. Its people traced their ancestry to Lot, Abraham's nephew, and therefore shared some familial ties with Israel. Yet relationships between the nations were often strained by religious and moral differences. Moabite worship centered on Chemosh, a deity whose cultic practices could include child sacrifice and temple prostitution, rituals abhorrent to Yahweh's law. Moab was known for its fertile grazing lands and trading routes, making it an attractive refuge for those fleeing famine, but also a place rife with cultural temptations. Naomi's family entered this foreign soil as economic refugees, longing simply for enough food to last through the lean years. Elimelech's decision to move was pragmatic, but it would have profound social and religious ramifications. In Moab, Naomi and her sons lived apart from the covenantal safeguards that protected widows and orphans under Israel's social code. The Levitical cities, the annual festivals, the gleaning laws, all the mechanisms that expressed God's care through communal obedience were absent. Instead, the family would navigate a land where the gods of their hosts held sway, and where marriage alliances could pull them ever deeper into Moabite religion. Tragedy struck quickly. Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widowed mother responsible for her two sons. As men of marriageable age, Mahlon and Chilion took Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth, perhaps in hopes that these alliances would stabilize their household. Yet within 10 years, both sons also died, plunging Naomi into deeper bereavement. What began as a pragmatic journey to survive a famine had become a pilgrimage through grief. Naomi, once a wife and mother, found herself stripped of husband and children, holding the unthinkable weight of cultural dislocation on top of personal loss. It is here, at the intersection of foreign soil and crushing sorrow, that Ruth's character and the story's theological contours emerge. Ruth, a Moabite by birth, faced a critical decision: return to her own family and the familiar temples of Chemosh, or follow Naomi back into the land of her husband's heritage, a place where Ruth had no legal standing, no guarantee of provision, and perhaps most daunting of all, no promise of acceptance. Yet in her famous declaration, "Your people shall be my people, and your God my God," Ruth chapter 1 verse 16, Ruth transcended social norms and ethnic barriers, embracing the covenant identity of Israel. Understanding several layers of social customs helps to illuminate just how radical this decision was. In Israel, widows relied on the kinsman redeemer Goel system, a male relative who could marry the widow to maintain her husband's lineage or buy back family land to ensure economic stability. In Moabite society, no such legal framework existed for Ruth. She was vulnerable on every front, socially, economically, and religiously. Yet Ruth's choice to align her destiny with Naomi's people and with Yahweh was not merely an act of sentimental loyalty. It was a covenantal pledge that placed her under Israel's law and under God's redemptive purposes. Back in Bethlehem, the return of Naomi and her daughter-in-law must have sparked curiosity among neighbors. "Is this Naomi?" they asked, stunned that she would come back empty. Ruth chapter 1 verse 21. Naomi's bitterness, expressed in her new name Mara, meaning bitter, reflected her perception that the Lord had dealt harshly with her. Yet God's unfolding providence would soon reveal that abandonment of one homeland had led Ruth and Naomi into the center of his redemptive plan. While the narrative of Ruth begins amid famine and displacement, it is set against a backdrop in which Israel's covenant promises were still active. The fields of Bethlehem, though poor in household goods, teemed with barley, and the harvest festival of Shavuot weeks would soon bring reapers into open fields. The social safety nets commanded by Torah, including leaving the edges of the field unharvested for the poor and the sojourner, were still practiced by godly landowners who honored the spirit of the law. It was into this world of agricultural generosity that Ruth stepped, gleaning what remained for gleaners like her. Naomi's journey home began in the shadow of profound loss. After 10 years in Moab, she returned to Bethlehem with 2 burdens heavier than any she had carried before: her status as a widow and her grief over losing both Mahan and Chilion. In Israelite society, widows occupied a precarious position. Without a husband or sons, Naomi had no male protector or provider and was wholly dependent on the goodwill of relatives and community. Yet she chose to return to Bethlehem empty, convinced that the Lord had dealt bitterly with her. Ruth chapter 1, verse 21. Beside Naomi walked Ruth, her daughter-in-law, whose own future lay in uncertainty. As a Moabite, Ruth had no legal right to land in Judah, no eligible kinsman redeemer waiting to preserve her dead husband's name, and no extended family network to welcome or support her. In Moab, she still had a home. Relatives, inheritance laws, and familiar temples dedicated to Chemosh. In Bethlehem, she faced the unknown, a foreign faith, unfamiliar customs, and a society that regarded Moabites with suspicion or outright hostility. When Naomi urged her daughters-in-law to return to their mothers' homes, Orpah reluctantly agreed and departed. But Ruth's response was immediate and unhesitating. "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. In these words, Ruth made a covenantal pledge, bonding herself not only to Naomi's fate, but to Israel's God and his people. This declaration was more radical than a vow of marital loyalty. It was a transfer of national and religious identity, a choice to abandon her native land and embrace Israel's covenant community. Ruth's choice carried practical implications as well as profound spiritual significance. In Bethlehem, she would be vulnerable to poverty and exploitation. The law permitted widows to glean in the fields, collecting leftover grain during harvest, but it offered no guarantee of sufficient food or safety. Gleaners depended on the generosity of landowners who honored Levitical commands to leave the edges of their fields unharvested. For Ruth, gleaning would be both a necessity and an act of faith. She would work among strangers, trusting that God's kindness, expressed through human hands, would provide. Yet Ruth's pledge revealed the driving force behind her actions: loyalty rooted in love. She refused to abandon Naomi at her most desperate, choosing instead to share in her hardships. In doing so, she enacted the principle of hesed, steadfast, covenantal love that extends loyalty beyond obligation. Hesed would later be central to God's own covenant relationship with Israel, and Ruth embodied it in a singular, personal way. Her commitment foreshadowed God's promise to his people, that he would never leave nor forsake those who cling to him. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6. The journey back to Bethlehem also represented a spiritual passage for Naomi. Initially, she perceived her return as a second exile, renaming herself Mara, meaning bitter, to reflect her despair. Yet Ruth's self-sacrifice and her embrace of Naomi's God stirred a change beneath the surface of Naomi's grief. Ruth's loyalty challenged Naomi's narrative of abandonment by demonstrating that bonds of love and faith could be renewed and restored. As they neared Bethlehem, the women's arrival piqued the curiosity of the townspeople. "Is this Naomi?" they asked. Ruth chapter 1 verse 19. Seeing her lean frame and hearing her bitter declaration, neighbors may have wondered how this once prosperous family had fallen so low. Yet in those humble beginnings lay the seed of God's redemptive work. Ruth's decision to adopt Naomi's people and God set in motion a chain of events that would draw the attention of Boaz, a relative of Elimelech, and ultimately secure a future neither woman could imagine. Ruth's loyalty was not a sentimental gesture but a transformative act of faith. By aligning herself with Naomi's people and God, she entered into Israel's covenant promises. Her pledge anticipated the kinsman redeemer's work: to seek out the vulnerable, to secure their place within the family, and to restore what was lost. In choosing Israel's God, Ruth stepped into the unfolding story of redemption that would culminate in King David and centuries later in Jesus Christ, the ultimate Redeemer. In reflecting on Naomi's loss and Ruth's choice, we see how personal fidelity mirrors divine faithfulness. Naomi's bitterness contrasted with Ruth's hope. Her emptiness contrasted with Ruth's abundant commitment. Together they modeled the tension between human despair and God's providential design. Ruth's pledge reminds us that loyalty anchored in covenant love has the power to redeem loss and to birth new life, even amid the darkest circumstances. Ruth rose early the next morning, her loyalty to Naomi driving her through the pre-dawn chill as she made her way to the barley fields. In Israel, God's law commanded landowners to leave the edges of their fields unharvested and to permit the poor, the sojourner, and the widow to glean what they could. Leviticus chapter 19 verses 9 to 10, Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 19 to 21. These provisions created a tangible safety net, ensuring that those without means could gather sustenance without shame. As a foreign widow, Ruth had no inheritance rights and no social standing. Gleaning was not merely an act of obedience, but a daily testament to her faith in Yahweh's provision through the hands of strangers. The field she entered belonged to Boaz, a wealthy landowner and relative of Naomi's late husband, Elimelech. Though Boaz had never met Ruth, he immediately noticed her perseverance and her modest dress, a sign of humility and devotion rather than ostentation. Under the ancient Near Eastern sky, with the sweat of labor on her brow, Ruth bent to pick up stray stalks of barley, her heart alive with gratitude, even as she filled the apron at her waist. Each handful represented both barley and blessing, proof that the God she now worshipped cared for her needs. Neighbors witnessed Ruth's diligence. Word spread quickly that this Moabite woman worked harder than many native daughters of Israel, and that she spoke tenderly of Naomi and of the Lord. At mealtimes, Boaz instructed his harvesters to drop extra bundles for her, to offer her water, and to protect her from harassment by other reapers. These gestures flowed from his reverence for Naomi. He had heard of her loyalty and sacrifice when she first left Moab. Boaz's kindness modeled the heart of the kinsman redeemer long before he formally took that role. He treated Ruth not as an outsider, but as a member of the community in need of care. Through Ruth's gleaning, God wove threads of provision into the fabric of her vulnerability. Each day she returned to Naomi with barley enough to fill a large basket, and with news of Boaz's favor. Naomi, once bitter, began to sense the Lord's hand guiding their steps. Where famine had once threatened their lives, fields now overflowed with grain. Where loss had stripped Naomi of hope, Ruth's stewardship of their livelihood rekindled confidence that God remained faithful to his promises of care for the widow and the sojourner. This ordinary work in the fields became extraordinary in its implications. Gleaning was more than charity. It was a declaration of community solidarity rooted in covenant law. Through this system, God demonstrated that justice and compassion are not abstract ideals, but daily practices. For Ruth, each stalk of barley affirmed her inclusion in Israel's story. For the community, every act of generosity toward her echoed God's commands to honor the vulnerable. As harvest gave way to threshing, Naomi saw that Ruth's labor had not only filled their household's coffers, but had also captured Boaz's attention and heart. The fields of Bethlehem, once symbols of scarcity and exile, became stages for divine providence. Through blade and bushel, through whispered blessings among reapers, and through the silent witness of a devoted daughter-in-law, the reality of God's covenant care shone brightly. In the simple act of gleaning, Ruth embodied the truth that loyalty and obedience, even in the most mundane tasks, can unlock the doors of grace and set in motion a redemptive plan far greater than any one life. As the barley harvest drew to a close, Naomi recognized that securing Ruth's future required more than gleaning. It required the intervention of a kinsman redeemer, or goel. In Israelite law, the goel was the nearest male relative, with both the right and the responsibility to preserve a deceased relative's name and property. His duties included marrying the widow to produce an heir, purchasing back forfeited land, and defending family rights. Leviticus chapter 25 verses 25 to 28, Deuteronomy chapter 25 verses 5 to 10. By doing so, the goel upheld the integrity of the clan and ensured economic stability for vulnerable members. Naomi encouraged Ruth to approach Boaz, who, though a relative of Elimelech, was not the closest kinsman. Still, his willingness to act would reveal God's providential care. Following Naomi's instructions, Ruth prepared herself for the threshing floor meeting. She washed, anointed with perfume, and dressed in her best clothes. Under the cover of night, she quietly approached Boaz as he lay sleeping on the grain, an act both bold and culturally sensitive, signaling her request without shame. Ruth chapter 3 verses 1 to 7. When Boaz awoke and discovered Ruth's presence, he responded with courtesy and respect rather than indignation. Recognizing her loyalty to Naomi and her humble request, "Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are a redeeming kinsman." Boaz praised her kindness and commitment to family. Ruth chapter 3 verses 9 to 11. His words highlight how God's law intended to elevate widows and the fatherless, not exploit them. Boaz's initial willingness to redeem by spreading his garment over Ruth signified his protective responsibility. Yet Boaz also demonstrated integrity. He admitted there was a closer kinsman with a prior right of redemption. Rather than bypassing the law for expediency, Boaz planned to consult the nearer relative at the city gate, a public, legally binding venue where transactions were witnessed by elders. Ruth chapter 4, verses 1 to 2. This respect for due process underscored the legitimacy of his commitment and showcased a commitment to justice as well as mercy. The next day, Boaz assembled 10 elders and the nearer kinsmen at the gate. He laid out the matter plainly. Elimelech's land, now for sale due to Naomi's departure, had a goel who could redeem it, thereby preserving the family's inheritance. The closer relative initially agreed, saying, "I will redeem it," until Boaz mentioned that redemption included marrying Ruth the Moabite widow, a stipulation that would jeopardize his own estate and lineage. Ruth chapter 4 verses 4 to 6. Reluctantly, the nearer kinsman renounced his right, clearing the way for Boaz to assume both property and marriage obligations. With the transaction official, Boaz instructed the elders and the assembled crowd to witness his redemption of Naomi's land and his intention to marry Ruth. He exchanged 6 measures of barley, a symbol of the land's value, for Naomi, thereby repurchasing the fields. Then, in an act that bound him irrevocably to Ruth and her children, he declared, "Spread the corner of your garment over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Ruth chapter 4 verse 9. This legal ritual completed the goel's duty, preserving the family name through a child born to Ruth. Through Boaz's actions, God's covenant provisions came alive. The kinsman redeemer law was designed not merely as a legal mechanism, but as a manifestation of God's heart for the vulnerable. By marrying Ruth, Boaz ensured her social standing, protected her rights and granted her security in a patriarchal society. His generosity went beyond mere compliance. His unsolicited gifts of food, protection in the fields, and refusal to rest until the redemption was sealed speak of a character shaped by divine hesed, steadfast, covenantal love. Boaz's redemption of Ruth and Naomi had ripple effects far beyond their own household. The child born to Ruth and Boaz, Obed, became the grandfather of King David, integrating a foreign widow into Israel's royal lineage. In this way, God's inclusive grace breaks ethnic barriers, weaving even Moabites into the tapestry of his redemptive plan. For contemporary believers, the story of Boaz as kinsman redeemer offers rich insights. First, it illustrates how biblical law safeguards the vulnerable and channels communal responsibility. Second, it shows that true redemptive love often requires personal sacrifice and risk, a willingness to spread one's cloak over another, offering protection and provision. Third, it points us forward to Christ, our ultimate Redeemer, who paid the highest price to reclaim us, though we were far from home and outside the covenant. As we reflect on Boaz's role, we see that redemption is both legal and relational. It binds us to one another in community, calls us to honor divine statutes of justice, and invites us into transformative grace. Boaz didn't just restore property, he restored dignity, identity, and hope. In doing so, he anticipated the gospel's power, a power that rescues, incorporates, and renews across every boundary. The long-awaited fulfillment of God's covenant promises begins to crystallize in Ruth's marriage to Boaz and the birth of their son, Obed. After the legal redemption ceremony at the city gate, where Boaz assumed responsibility for Naomi's land and for the welfare of Ruth, the couple married and Ruth conceived. Naomi's bitterness, once reflected in her adopted name Mara, dissolved as she took the child and laid him in her lap. Ruth chapter 4, verse 16. The community celebrated. "A son has been born to Naomi," they declared, and the women exclaimed, "Naomi has a son." Ruth chapter 4, verse 17. Naomi, who had returned empty, now brimmed with joy and purpose. Obed's birth was more than a personal blessing. It represented the restoration of Elimelech's family line and the preservation of land inheritance through the Goel principle. The child would carry forward the name of Mahlon, Naomi's deceased son, ensuring that his memory and the family's place among Israel would endure. But the significance extends even further. Obed became the grandfather of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David, Israel's greatest king. In this way, a story that began in famine and exile rippled outward into the heart of Israel's national destiny. The Moabite Ruth, through her loyalty and integration into Israel's covenant community, became part of the lineage of the Messiah, Matthew chapter 1, verses 5 to 6. This trajectory underscores a key theme of the book of Ruth. God's providence works through ordinary human fidelity to accomplish extraordinary redemptive ends. Naomi and Ruth could not have foreseen the dynasty that would emerge, yet their choices, Naomi's determination to return and Ruth's pledge of allegiance, set into motion a divine plan that spanned generations. The narrative draws attention to God's ability to bring life from death, blessing from loss. In a society where widows and foreigners were vulnerable, God elevated Ruth and secured Naomi's future, revealing that no one is outside the scope of his redeeming love. Moreover, the inclusion of a Moabite in Israel's most celebrated lineage challenges prevailing social and religious boundaries. Moabites were officially forbidden from entering the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3. Yet in the economy of God's grace, Ruth's faithfulness overrides ethnic prejudice. Her story invites us to consider how the gospel transcends human categories, race, nationality, status, and grasps believers into the family of God. Ruth foreshadows Gentile inclusion in Christ, demonstrating that steadfast loyalty to the true God earns a place in his covenant community. The legacy of Ruth and Boaz also models how faith and works intertwine in divine providence. Ruth's proactive gleaning in Boaz's fields and Boaz's generous protection and legal obedience together paved the way for restoration. Their partnership reflects a synergy between human responsibility and divine initiative. Ruth labored faithfully, Boaz acted justly, and God honored their combined obedience by weaving them into the messianic line. This story's resonance carries forward into the life of David, whose kingship was marked by both triumph and failure, but who remained a man after God's own heart. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. The seeds of David's character, loyalty, humility, dependence on God, can be traced back to Ruth's example. Through her hesed, the covenant love that binds faithful hearts, Ruth becomes a spiritual ancestor to David and ultimately to Jesus himself. Each generation builds on the faithfulness of the prior one, illustrating how individual acts of loyalty contribute to God's broader redemptive narrative. Finally, Ruth's legacy offers hope to those who feel excluded or disenfranchised. Her journey from Moabite outsider to honored matriarch reminds us that God sees beyond our backgrounds and is able to elevate the humble. In a world where many feel marginalized by culture, economics, or past mistakes, Ruth's story speaks of belonging and purpose. It assures us that when we choose loyalty to God and kindness to others, we participate in a story that transcends our immediate circumstances and echoes through eternity. As you've walked alongside Naomi and Ruth, you've seen how grief can drive us into exile, and how a single act of loyalty can draw us back into God's unfolding story. Imagine standing in those dusty barley fields at dawn. You're bent low, gathering what others leave behind, yet every handful you lift is a whisper of God's promise. That is the invitation Ruth offers you today. When life strips you bare, when loss, displacement, or rejection leave you feeling empty, know that God notices every silent step you take in faith. Notice how Ruth refused the safer path. She could have returned to her own kin where her name and heritage might have guaranteed her a place. Instead, she chose Naomi's pain, Naomi's people, and Naomi's God. In that moment, Ruth teaches you a critical truth. True allegiance demands risk. It means stepping into uncertainty with your eyes fixed on the character of Yahweh rather than on your own comfort or reputation. Then there's Boaz, whose compassion reached beyond obligation. He didn't merely obey the law, he delighted in it. When he saw Ruth, he saw Naomi's faithfulness reflected back at him, and he acted. He made sure she had water, extra provisions, and safety among his harvesters. Boaz reminds you that your small kindnesses, holding the door for a weary neighbor, listening without judgment, offering your resources to someone in need, are threads in God's grand tapestry of redemption. When Ruth approached the threshing floor at Naomi's direction, she risked disgrace to secure her future and ours. She asked Boaz to spread his cloak over her, invoking the ancient symbol of protection and commitment. In that bold request, you glimpsed the heart of the kinsman redeemer, God himself, who laid aside his robes of heaven to cover you with his mercy. As Boaz honored her plea, so Christ answers every plea you bring, no matter how broken or unworthy you feel. Finally, picture the moment Naomi held baby Obed on her lap. Her sorrow gave way to joy so complete that the entire town celebrated. You may not see the full scope of God's plan in your own seasons of waiting, but take heart. Every tear you've shed is counted, and God wastes nothing. Your faithfulness in the small things, the fields of everyday obedience, prepares the way for blessings that stretch beyond your lifetime. So today, leave these scenes behind the book's pages and let them shape your own story. Risk loyalty when it's costly. Offer kindness when it seems unreturned. Trust God's providence when your fields look barren. And remember that, just as a Moabite widow became grandmother to Israel's greatest king, your faithfulness now can echo into eternity. Let Ruth's hesed, her steadfast covenant love, be the anthem of your life, and watch how God turns your seasons of loss into legacies of grace.